So I thought, just to start with, I would ask you a couple of questions, just so I could get a sense of who is in the room. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the people that you know. And when I ask you these questions, you can include yourself in the answers, right? So how many of you know somebody among your friends, family, whatever it is, who's gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and who's out at this point? Okay, vast majority. How many of you would have answered that question differently 20 years ago? Okay, maybe about a quarter of people. How many of you know people in your friends, family, whatever, who are trans? Some people, but a minority. How many of those people would have answered that question differently 20 years ago? Most of those people. Okay. How many of you have seen clients, students, whatever, who are there because they're in a state of distress and their sexuality has something to do with that? All of you. No surprise there, right? Studies have shown since at least the 80s that lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals show up in therapy a lot more than their heterosexual counterparts do. How many of you have seen those students who happen to be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but their sexuality doesn't really seem to be that material to the problem that you're working on with them? Some of you. Okay, that's also interesting because that's one of the things that people report about in therapy is the sense to which they have the space to be there, be out, be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and not have that be the topic in the room, okay? Because sometimes it needs to not be the topic in the room because other things come around for people. How many of you have seen trans clients, non-binary clients, clients who are exploring their gender identities in your therapy? Most of you now, okay, this is not spread. How many of you would have answered that question differently 5 years ago? Okay, because things are happening very fast. And how many of you have seen those kinds of clients for whom they just happen to be trans, non-binary, exploring their gender, but that wasn't really the issue, that wasn't really material to the issue? Very few of you, okay? So clients who are sexual minorities are much more likely, it seems, in Ireland, if we just take you as a sample, to have that experience, to have their sexuality not be the thing in the room that gets talked about, whereas that's less of a case for gender. That's not a critique of what you're doing. It's not intended to be a critique. It's not meant to implicitly sound like that. Just beginning to get a sense of where we are, right? Where we are, who our clients are, and who it is that we know. Okay, so I just thought as well what I would do is, I have not been a therapist, but I have been a client. And I would kind of talk a little bit to introduce myself about what it was like to be a client at various points in time. So back in the day, 100 years ago, or a quarter of a century anyway, when Angie and I were in college, I was not the well-presented, well-dressed, interdisciplinary, international homosexual that you see standing before you today. Angie has very generously said that I was studying away in the library. What she didn't say was that I was probably wearing bits of my school uniform or a purple tracksuit, had really bad hair, and was hiding in the closet, okay? And you have that guy in your caseload, right? Or maybe you don't, because I would have been absolutely terrified to go and speak to one of you, right? Towards the end of that period, before I went off to the States, I had what I thought was a conversation with a very, very close friend where I had laid myself completely bare, where I had come out of the closet, where I had told him something that I had never told anybody before. And I really worked up to this conversation, and I selected this friend very, very carefully because I thought he was the safest person to do this with. I had a conversation a year later when I was out of the closet to many more people, and I realized that in that conversation, I had concealed myself perfectly. He had no idea. Right? And this is part of what it feels like, is to be not part of the experience of being in the closet for many students, is to be not in control of your narrative. So I went off to the States in 1993, after finishing my degree in Trinity in 92, and I came out there, and that's real ordinary as well, right? It's like you go away, you get out of your family context, that frees things up for you, that allows you to explore identity, and that's what college is like for many students, right? Being a Dublin student, that kind of happened for me when I went to do my postgraduate. So then I was in the San Francisco Bay Area, in this university, which was very, very high pressured and very, very stressful, and exploring coming out and all of that. And then from a friend of a friend of a friend back in Trinity, like not really somebody I had ever met, I heard this story about myself. And this person said, oh, Peter Hegarty, I always knew he was gay. And the reason I always knew he was gay was because I saw him in the George, which is the identifiable gay pub in Dublin, even a quarter of a century ago. And he had his hand on this guy's arse, and I saw him in there, and I always knew he was gay. Now, rightly or wrongly, I had never darkened the door of the George at that point in my life. So this is another way in which narratives get out of control when you're in the closet or when you're coming out, which is other people will tell stories to fill the gap of what your life means and what your life is about. So those are kind of some of the themes I want to explore with you today from various vantage points. The idea about being silenced, being invisible, not existing, not recognizing yourself even, not even being visible to yourself in the mirror, but at the same time being a spectacle, being an object of gossip, being something that is talked about, something where the narratives get filled in from other people, maybe who don't know you that well, or maybe are not your real friends to begin with. So today is going to be organized into 5 bits because we've got loads of time, okay? We've got loads of time. And I do a few different things. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, ran off to Stanford, supposed to do this PhD in experimental psychology and cognitive psychology. That kind of went a little bit different. Ultimately did a PhD in social psychology, but got really, really interested in history along the way. And one of the things I want to get you interested in today is history, and thinking about the historical context in which you're now working and how they change the nature of psychology. So there's kind of 5 bits to today, right? There's what I'm going to call the history bit, there's the culture bit, there's the social psychology bit, there's the history of psychology bit, and then there's the campus experience bit, right? So those are the 5 bits. So I am really coming at you from somebody who is not a psychotherapist. I come from other ends of the discipline, right? I do experiments on people on things like language, which I'll talk about in a moment, and I also write books about the history of psychology. So that's where I'm coming from, but I'll try and meet you by the end. So history is one of those words like maths that strikes fear into the heart of people, and people go back to their school experiences of awful dusty books like this, right? And what I want to do in this bit is actually just get you thinking about how we exist in historical time and how recognizing that is a bit of a shake-up to your thinking if you're trained to be a psychologist. And I'm going to do that by talking, first of all, about screwdrivers. Now, you might have a pack of screwdrivers like this at home, right? And this is wonderful because it's kind of a screwdriver for every purpose, okay? Now, I want you to think about that conversation that you have with your partner, we all do it, when you've been to IKEA. And you're building the thing, right? The flat pack thing, and you know, there's one critical left-right mistake, and if you get it, your marriage is on the rocks, right? So I want you to imagine that you're having that conversation with your partner and how you can get locked into positions, right? You can get very committed to things like which screwdriver to use, right? So imagine one of you is very committed to the yellow screwdriver, right? And think, yes, absolutely. And that was the first one you picked up, and you kind of got playing with it, and you got good with the yellow screwdriver. And the other one of you is really good at the blue screwdriver, okay? And you're like, yeah, blue screwdriver. You don't know this yet, but you need the pink screwdriver, okay? But neither of you has actually figured that out. So this is my way of talking about history and what history is and how we are historical beings, right? So I think that in psychology, and this is an argument that I've developed with my colleague Mike Pettit, who is also a historian of psychology, and this was published in the recent first APA Handbook of Sexuality. As a psychologist, as a research psychologist, I think we study events that happen to people over different kinds of timescales. So a lot of the time, what I do as an experimental psychologist gets done and dusted within an hour, right? Somebody comes into the lab, they do some kind of task, we measure some things, they go home, debriefed, everybody's happy, right? And so if learning happens, if change happens, it all happens within an hour. Increasingly, I've got colleagues who are neuroscientists, right, who study things that happen at the level of milliseconds, right, really, really tiny, tiny amounts of time. And events over these kinds of time frames are psychologically important, and we have good expertise about them. There are some really brave people who pan out from there to study long-term research, right? So, for example, you do something like an intervention. It's the rare study that looks at the follow-up 6 months or a year later, right? Those studies are rare. It's even rarer still to get people who can do cohort studies or longitudinal studies, and they can look at things over the span of a lifetime, right? So those things, so we do have methods there, but it starts to get thin. Then we've got history. Let's brush over that for a second. That's the purple screwdriver, right? And then we get up to here to what is our species history, right? The history that some of which we share with other organisms, some of which is particular to our species, but which was in place before we developed things like writing, agriculture, money, property, those kinds of things. And we have ways of studying those because they're sort of encoded in our biology, and we can study our biology. And again, I have colleagues who study that, and they have good methods for doing that. Now, our argument is we're really bad at this bit in psychology. But when it comes to sexuality, as it comes to so many topics, that stuff makes a difference, okay? So I was walking around Cork today, and I only have one relative in the room, which is surprising for a gathering this size. I was thinking about the fact, God, I'm walking around Cork. My oldest uncle was born here over 100 years ago. He's no longer living. What would it have been like 100 years ago? Can we even understand that, right? Can we even understand that? And what I want to say, if we want to understand how growing up in Cork now might be growing up different for growing up from my uncle 100 years ago, there's really nothing we can do here that's going to help, right? Because there's nothing that we're going to study about how lives vary now that's going to get at him, being born in Cork in 1913. Nor are we going to get anywhere by studying species biology, by understanding, our common biological inheritance. That's not going to get at the differences either. But surely sexuality was different, right? Surely being born in Cork before Ireland was a country, right? When things were still very much influenced by Victorian ethos, being born before World War I, right? And all that brought with the crisis of venereal disease, the new women, the roaring 20s, and everything that happened afterwards, right? The foundation of the state, all of that. Surely his psychological experience of sexuality, his understanding of that, his norms, his values, his practices, his understanding of himself, would all have been utterly different from a child born in Cork 100 years later. But we don't have ways of studying that. So instead, what we tend to do in psychology is we tend to argue over screwdrivers. And we do, as we build things out of a flatpack. And we don't quite have screwdrivers to play with, but we do have two theories that we keep coming back to. Nature and nurture, right? Nature and nurture, right? This idea that we're all the same, or actually we're different from each other in ways that we can understand by studying living people now, and that we can measure and assess and so on, and show that these things are down to choice and situations and so on. And what Mike and I want to argue is that actually we're missing the pink screwdriver, okay? We're missing the pink screwdriver. And what I want you to go away with today is a sense that actually you've got the pink screwdriver, okay? And it's another way of thinking about what it is that you're doing and how you're acting in historical time, whether that's a conversation that you're having with a client or something that you're doing in a professional organization. Now, at the moment, I'm working on a short book, which is a recent history of the development of lesbian and gay affirmative psychology since the 1970s. It's focused very much on the United States because that's where most of the developments happen, although with deference to the screwdrivers, over time it becomes a more global history as globalization happens and things get more interconnected and international bodies become more important. I'm doing this because nobody's done it. And because I'm kind of a bit sick and tired of having the undergraduate student walk in and say, do you know what, I really want to study gay and lesbian psychology because I'm coming out, or my friend is, or my mother did, or I think sexuality is cool, right? And I kind of want something that you can give that student to say, do you know what, you should read this and you should know what stream you're stepping into, what the purple screwdriver looks like before you go on with it, because it doesn't exist. And I think that people without their history are a weak people. So digging into this, there's lots of ways in which lesbian and gay psychology is really quite particular and historically important. So people in the world of the history of medicine study demedicalization, the processes by which things that we medicalize and pathologize become depathologized in our culture. Probably the person who studied this most is a sociologist called Peter Conrad, and he argues that the two best examples of this that have ever happened in any culture are the depathologizing of homosexuality and the depathologizing of masturbation, right? So if you're interested in the history of medicine at all, you have to take lesbian and gay psychology seriously. Everything changed in the 1980s because of the emergence of the HIV epidemic, right? Which in the United States, as in many developed countries, was first, had its biggest impact among men who have sex with men. So in the early years of the epidemic, about 71% of the people who were living with HIV in the United States were gay and bisexual men. And it became in the national interest to do outreach with gay and bisexual communities, right? And that completely changed where gay affirmative perspectives went in psychology, right? Moved them from margin to mainstream. So it became the #1 public health epidemic. I also know a lot of people in the social sciences who study trends in public opinion, right? How does public opinion about this issue or that issue change? In the 1990s, public opinion people are completely surprised because something historic happens, right? Which is that people start to get a lot more gay-friendly. They stop caring if people have sex with each other, right? And they kind of don't really want laws that are against that anymore, okay? And that happens for weird and unexpected reasons. Usually around sexuality stuff, as people get a bit older, they get more conservative. But what also happens is the very old people die, and they get replaced by younger people who are more liberal, right? So those two things usually even each other out. Something very different happened in the 1990s about gay and lesbian issues, which is that as people started to get older, they also started to get more gay-friendly. That hadn't happened before. It didn't happen around other sexuality issues. It just happened around this one. It was special. It was historic. It was unique. Also, what was changing in our culture more than anything at that point in time, the adoption of technology, right? So in the 2000 census in the United States, it's the first time you see that a majority of Americans, over 50%, have got the internet at home, okay? Gay, lesbian, bisexual people are early adopters of the internet and use it to do sexuality and relationships in new ways, right? From cyber chat to hooking up online for sex to finding relationship partners, right? I found my partner on the internet, just so you know. Then we went back looking for a dog, but we haven't finished. So by the sort of after this period, by now sort of getting into the contemporary period where sort of gay marriage becomes like this big hot topic, and it becomes a pivotal issue in part of the culture wars. It seems to define the difference between liberals and conservatives in a way that it didn't before. And throughout all of this, psychology is really important. Psychologists are really important historical actors. And what you can see is that psychologists are using legal strategies to bring about gay and lesbian rights in the United States all the time. So that's what I'll be talking about in part 4. So how do you kind of approach this history, right? Well, as psychologists, we know that people are very subjective, right? And that we don't just take facts in, we kind of make sense of them. And some of the ways that we make sense of things are affected by the fact that we live in history, right? And one of the things that a lot of historians talk about is the way in which it often seems that things are inevitable that it will turn out the way they turned out, right? It seems as if, it's going to work out that way all along. And around this issue, people often think, do you know what, things are just getting better. Things are just getting better on their own, and that's lovely. And they're just going to continue to get better. Okay? Actually, no. Things get better because people do things, because people exercise historical agency individually and especially in small collectives. So in the next bit, I just wanted to sort of talk you through how we might think about history and introduce you to this friend of mine, Baruch Fischoff, who was an early cognitive psychologist. And he did these studies where, in Israel in the early 1970s, where he gave people little stories about historical events. Anybody ever heard about the British War with the Gurkhas in Nepal? Oh, amazing. Nobody had for his studies, right? So he gave people these stories about how this would work out. It was a very interesting war because the British had stronger military strength, but the Gurkhas had the home advantage, which usually wins in a guerrilla war. And there were 4 possible endings to this story. The British win, the Gurkhas win, everybody kills everybody, or it's a long stalemate. And people read one of the 4 versions of the stories. Then afterwards, they were told that other people had read other versions of the story, and they were asked to estimate how likely do you think it was each ending was. Now, the interesting thing is, here's the number, the percentages for people for their own endings. 57%, 38, 48, 27. And what you can see is they're all greater than 25%, right? Once you've lived through something and you've heard the narrative, it's very hard to then come back, to peel back and think about how things would be different. Now, I interviewed Fischoff recently for a historical project, and one of the things that's interesting about this experiment, to folks like yourself, is that he didn't just do this with historical events, he also did it with therapy cases. So he gave people examples of a client in therapy that could have one of 4 different outcomes. And again, you see the same things. So maybe that rings true, the idea that once you've seen a client through and they've ended, you have a sense of, oh, well, of course it was going to end up that way. Or of course, no, it was very contingent. And you probably did things in there that were very important. So this is called the hindsight bias or creeping determinism. Historians call this presentism, the way in which we sort of see the world from the landscape of the present and make the past a foreign country. Fischoff had this to say about how this way of thinking stops us from learning from the past. He said, when we attempt to understand past events, we implicitly test the hypotheses or rules that we use to both interpret and anticipate the world around us. If in hindsight we systematically underestimate the surprises which the past held and holds for us, we are subjecting those hypotheses to inordinately weak tests and presumably finding little reason to change them. Thus, the very outcome knowledge which gives us the feeling that we understand what the past was all about may prevent us from learning anything about it. So a lot of cognitive framing of things there. This is early cognitive psychology, 1970s. But I think that last sentence is important, right? That sense when you think you've gotten to understand the past, because you've written a story, a little causal story of how it all happened, is actually things that stop you realizing how contingent it was, how random it was, how possible it was that things could come out different. And I think that's an important message, because once you grasp that, you can see that you can be historical agents in the present. Fischoff is quite a reflexive guy, and some time ago, this project is actually quite relevant to the talk. He wrote this a number of years ago, reflecting back on his own research. He said about 20 years later, someone asked for the other stimuli, so the other examples of the therapy cases. He said, I was stunned to discover how inappropriate one had become. Taken from Ellis, 1966, it described a troubled homosexual in terms that fit now antiquated mores and theories. Although I sent it, I argue that it should not be used. In addition to being offensive, it had changed the meaning so much that using it would not represent a replication. So that's Albert Ellis, by the way, who developed rational emotive therapy, who had very, very strange views about sexuality if you dig into that. I would expect more historical research will emerge on that recently, as his archives have just been opened in the last couple of years. So to end off the historical bit, what I want to sort of say is, you live in a land of purple screwdrivers, right? And as psychologists, we're not trained to do that, right? We're trained to do the blue versus pink thing, and then think, oh, maybe they interact, right? It's like, if you've ever done that with your partner, with one of you's poking in with the blue and one of you's poking in with the yellow one, that doesn't make the furniture look nice either, right? You need the pink screwdriver. And certainly in Ireland, at the moment, there's some pretty big pink screwdrivers going on in terms of LGBT issues, and that may have been the reason why the conference has the theme. So last year, of course, for the first time, Ireland became the first country which, by popular vote, voted in equal marriage. Who's heard of that? Silly, no. Okay, later in the summer, Slovenia, by a vote also of about 2-1, voted against introducing same-sex marriage. Who heard of that? Yeah, okay. So I think that's also part of presentism, right? And how we tell these stories that things are getting better all the time. Now, of course, Ireland is massively more relevant in Ireland than Slovenia is. But even on the global stage, there was a huge spotlight on Ireland when that happened. Slovenia was kind of overlooked when it happened. But actually, the two cases are very interesting to think about in relationship to each other. Later on the same summer, the Gender Recognition Act came in. Ireland really didn't have any legislation in terms of gender recognition in terms of this, but is now the 4th country in the world to have gender recognition based on self-determination, which by and large sort of cuts mental health professionals out of the equation. This only applies to people who are over the age of 18, which I guess is about the age at which they start to come to college. So you may be experiencing, or you may soon be experiencing, people, and a sort of a bit of a backlog here of people who've been looking for gender recognition who will be coming through the system quite quickly. I think about 150 people have applied for certificates so far. That's what I've heard. Okay, so so that's what I want to do today. Right? I'm going to talk about history, and I'm going to talk about recent history, and I'm going to talk about how we assemble this thing of lesbian and gay affirmative psychology, which then became LGBT psychology. But it's really fast. Right? It's really fast. I mean, I'm not an old man. There's a bit of grey hair there, but it's not that bad. But we live in a different historical period from when Angie and I were in college. Okay? And part of what I want to do is give you a sense of how much has changed, how much is changing. And so this will, for some of you, will be going, oh yeah, remember that? Yeah, that was a thing 20 years ago. And for some of you, some of these things might be new. Anybody remember this stuff from the 1980s? Remember the Far Side cartoons? Yes, okay, right. We're showing your age now, right? Okay, so it's great. Gary, I use these ironic comments for science nerds, largely. And here we have, our stereotypical natives fleeing and, hiding their technology before the anthropologists, decked out in khaki, decamp from the canoe. Okay. But I actually want to take anthropology quite seriously in this next section of the talk, because anthropology is a very old discipline, and it's got ways of thinking about culture that are surprisingly useful in this context. And so I'm going to start by sort of reading quite a bit from what will seem like quite an old anthropological study, but it is relevant, and I think that will become clear as we sort of focus our attention on it. This is a study that was done by a guy called Smiler, I think, in the 1950s, of a group called the Nasi Mera. Has anybody ever heard of Nasi Mera culture? One person, okay, has heard, okay. So that sometimes this does still have a bit of an audience, but as I say, this is from the 1950s. So this is his account of Nasi Mera culture and what Nasi Mera life was like. He says, the anthropologist has become so familiar with the diversity of ways in which different people behave in similar situations that he is not apt to be surprised by even the most exotic customs. In fact, if all of the logically possible combinations of behavior have not been found somewhere in the world, he is apt to suspect that they must be present in some yet undescribed tribe. This point has, in fact, been expressed with respect to clan organization by Murdoch. In this light, the magical beliefs and practices of the Nasi Mera present such unusual aspects that it seems desirable to describe them as an example of the extremes to which human behavior can go. Professor Linton first brought the ritual of the Nasi Mera to the attention of anthropologists 20 years ago, but the culture of this people is still very poorly understood. They're a North American group living in the territory between the Canadian Cree, the Iaucc, the Tarahumara of Mexico, and the Carib and Arawak of the Antilles. Little is known of their origin, although tradition states that they came from the east. According to Nasi Mera mythology, their nation was originated by a culture hero, Nochingao, who is otherwise known for two great feats of strength: the chopping of a piece of wampum across the river Patamac, and the chopping down of a cherry tree in which the spirit of truth resided. Nasi Mera culture is characterized by a highly developed market economy, which is evolved in a rich natural habitat. While much of the people's time is devoted to economic pursuits, a large part of the fruits of the labor and a considerable portion of the day are spent in ritual activity. The focus of this activity is the human body, the appearance and health of which loom as a dominant concern in the ethos of the people. While such a concern is certainly not unusual, its ceremonial aspects and associated philosophy are unique. The fundamental belief underlying the whole system appears to be that the human body is ugly and that its natural tendency is to debility and disease. Incarcerated in such a body, man's only hope is to avert these characteristics through the use of the powerful influences of ritual and ceremony. Every household has one or more shrines devoted to this purpose. The more powerful individuals in society have several shrines in their houses, and in fact the opulence of a house is often referred to in terms of the number of such ritual shrines centers it possesses. Most houses are of wattle and daub construction, but the shrine rooms of the more wealthy are walled with stone. Poorer families imitate the rich by applying pottery plaques to their shrine walls. While each family has its one shrine, the rituals associated with it are not family ceremonies, but are private and secret. The rites are normally only discussed with children, and then only during the period when they are being initiated into these mysteries. I was able, however, to establish sufficient rapport with the natives to examine these shrines and to have the rituals described to me. Okay, so you're getting a sense there of who the Nasi Mera are and what they're about, okay? And you might have conjured up a mental image of, people a bit like this, right? Yeah, they're kind of your sort of classic natives that your anthropologists used to study in days of yore, and that's what anthropology is at this time. Okay, so just going to go on the first page as well so you can see it. Anybody spot anything unusual? I'm not going to ask you what it is. Anybody spot anything unusual? Okay, woman at the front, gentleman at the back, a couple of people here. I spotted something unusual. Okay, so so look at the word Nasi Mera again. Now spell it backwards. Okay? All right. Let's read through that whole thing again. Okay? Let's read through that whole thing again. But this time, what I want you to have in mind is these folks, not because they've got the trappings of the stereotypical native of the anthropologist, but because they've got microwave ovens and a video recorder, right? It's the 80s, so that's probably VHS, right? You know? They probably don't even have that now. They're probably just on Netflix. Okay, so let's look at it again, and this time have that mental image of Americans in mind and think about what this is about. Okay, the anthropologist has become so familiar with the diversity of ways in which different people behave in different situations that he is not apt to be surprised by even the most exotic customs. In fact, if all of the logically possible combinations of behavior have not been found somewhere in the world, he is apt to suspect that they may be present in some undescribed tribe. This point has in fact been expressed with respect to clan organization by Murdoch in the light the magical beliefs and practices of the Nasi Mera present such unusual aspects that it seems desirable to describe them as an example of the extremes to which human behavior can go. Okay? So this is kind of classic how to describe people who are not you, right? How to other people. And there's several things that he is doing here, right? He's describing people as extremes, right? He's also describing them as a scientist, right? This is an example of human behavior. And we can study it, and we should study it, and we're entitled to study it because science is a project that belongs to everybody in humanity, even though it doesn't seem to belong to these people at all. Okay? Let's go on. There's a lot of clues in this one, if you think about it. Professor Linton first brought the ritual of the Nasi Mera to the attention of anthropologists 20 years ago. But the culture of this people is still very poorly understood. They're a North American group, that's a clue, living in the territory between the Canadian Cree, think about it, the Iaucc and Tarahumara of Mexico, what's between Canada and Mexico, the Carib and Arawak of the Antilles, the Caribbean. Little is known of their origin, although tradition states that they came from the East, right? Not all of them did, right, come from the East. But that's certainly what the tradition says, right? According to Nasi Mera mythology, their nation was originated by a culture hero, not Kinehau, and if you spell that word, it's Washington, right? Who is otherwise known for two great feats, the throwing of a piece of wampum across the river Potomac and the chopping down of the cherry tree, right? Okay, so if you know a little bit about Washington, then those stories make sense to you. And also, of course, what he's very cleverly done here is said, this is the story that tradition tells, right? But you know enough about American history to know that this is one understanding of where the nation came from. This is the story that kind of makes European people central in it and everybody else pretty much off the map. But isn't this a nice way of showing how an anthropologist can come in, take a culture story, and just make a simple story of it that erases the complexity? Nazi Americulture is characterized by a highly developed market economy which has evolved in a rich natural habitat. I mean, I love that, how just describing that as a natural just makes it sound like, oh yeah, they're going to be trading in grain, and there's going to be funny things, and like money that looks like shells, and all those kinds of stereotypes of old anthropology studies come into your head. But of course it is a highly developed market economy, it's a capitalist economy. And it is in a rich natural habitat. North America is a rich natural habitat. While many of the people's time is devoted to economic pursuits, going to work, a large part of the fruits of the labor and a considerable portion of the day are spent in ritual activity. Ritual is a great word for anthropologists, right? Once you can call something a ritual, then you know you've got people in the position of being the other, right? Because if what they're doing is kind of magical and a bit superstitious, then you're up and running. But it's an open question. How many times are people actually asked if something is ritual or not? The focus of this activity is the human body, the appearance and health of which loom as a dominant concern in the ethos of the people. While such a concern is certainly not unusual, its ceremonial aspects and associated philosophy are unique. This is true. Who cleans themselves as often as Americans do in the 1950s? The fundamental belief underlying the whole system seems to be that the human body is ugly and that its natural tendency is to debility and disease, right? Now again, nobody probably said this to him explicitly. No anthropologist ever had to get somebody to say this to them. You know what? Our fundamental philosophy is this, right? You can just infer it, and that becomes a truth in anthropology at this point in time. Incarcerated in such a body, man's only hope is to avert these characteristics through the use of the powerful influence of ritual and ceremony. Here we go again. Every household has one or more of these shrines devoted to the purpose. The more powerful individuals in the house have several shrines in their house. And in fact, the opulence of the house is often referred to in terms of the number of such ritual centers it possesses. My house, how many bathrooms does your house have? Most houses are of wattle and daub construction, as are brick-built houses, but the shrine rooms of the more wealthy are walled with stone, marble. Poorer families imitate the rich by applying pottery plaques to their wall shrines, tiles. Okay. While each family has at least one shrine, the rituals associated with are not family ceremonies, but are private and secret. You go into the bathroom on your own. The rites are normally only discussed with children, and then only during the period when they're being initiated into these mysteries. You tell your children how to use the bathroom. I was able, however, to establish sufficient rapport with the natives, good for you, to examine these shrines, got to go to the bathroom and have a sniff around, and to have the rituals described to me. And from here, it kind of goes on and it gets funnier and funnier, and you talk about brushing your teeth, and ritual cleansing sticks and that are made out of pig hair, and you know how it's such a terrible taboo to use somebody else's ritual pig stick, and it goes on and on and on. But you get the idea, right? And the idea is about the way in which academic disciplines socially construct reality, right? So this is the 1950s. And this is obviously a piece of parody. This is a piece of irony, right? That was written in an anthropological journal with absolutely no introduction. So people were sort of taken along and had the psychological effect that I hope you've just experienced. Now, over the 1960s, of course, what happened globally in terms of history was a massive project by the United Nations to decolonize the world, right? So many countries that were colonies of former European countries, or of former European empires in the 1950s, were decolonized, right? And became nation states by the end of the 1960s. This had a profound effect on power relations in anthropology, right? Because anthropologists suddenly found themselves confronted by the natives saying, actually, we're going to speak for ourselves now, and we're going to critique your scientific way of doing things. And this initiated in anthropology two things. First of all, it became a much smaller science. Fewer people did it because it wasn't jacked into some big colonial project anymore. And secondly, it became a more reflexive scientist. Anthropologists thought a lot about how they write about people and about how their ways of writing about people objectified realities and objectified people and actually kind of objectified what are quite subjective meanings. In psychology, we didn't do that. We took the word subject and we replaced it with participant. And we stopped using kind of sexist language like man and he. That was about it. That was about as far as we went over the same project. And because what we do for nation states, which is largely manage people who are in states of distress, or we manage the relationship between children and curriculum, or we do other kinds of things in more recent years. And because those things have still been ongoing, psychology has remained a very, very large discipline, right? With hundreds and hundreds of undergraduates that you can easily recruit to, very different from anthropology. It wasn't inevitable that it would have turned out that way, and you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that if you'd been standing in 1950, but it certainly has if we look at it now in 2016. So you can play with this, certainly. Obviously, you could invent a tribe called the Hisiri if you want, and you can kind of develop your own stories if you want. You can probably think of creative things to do with that. But certainly, over the history of anthropology, the question came around, who are the natives now? Now, as part of that sort of rethinking of what it means to have culture, and the recognition that culture is not something that happens over there to them, but that culture, subjectivity, ritual, all of those things are things that we're doing all the time. Part of that evening out was anthropologists reflected on some very basic assumptions. So they reflected on the assumption, for example, that they had assumed that Western people knew the biologically correct, natural, scientific facts of how kinship work, right? And that other people out there in the colonies had strange ritual, mystical beliefs about how kinship and sexuality work. And so we can kind of understand them by understanding how they're kind of a biased version of our scientific understanding. And that began to change as part of this in the 1960s when an American anthropologist called David Schneider started to study how ordinary middle-class Americans understand kinship, biological relatedness, and the basic question of who is in your family and who's not in your family, which Declan reminded me of yesterday. But as part of that, what I want to say is that it's not only your kind of stereotypical natives that the anthropologists used to study who became caught up in those power dynamics, but gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender cultures did as well. Okay? So it's also over the past 40 years that in anthropology, people started to look at these cultures differently, and they started to become really theoretically significant in how we understand the very basic stuff of culture. What is culture? What is family? What is kinship? What is gender? What is belief? What is performance? So back in the 50s, you would see things like this by Cleland Ford and Frank Beach. That's what anthropology and understanding of sexual culture would have looked like. Looking around the animal species and then looking around the human societies kind of in the same way and saying, look, there's lots of variation here. Often with a kind of pro-gay message of saying, look, there's variations. There's culture where homosexuality is accepted, unlike our own. So kind of nice message, but still within that kind of Nassimera framework. In 1969, Esther Newton published Mother Camp, which was her dissertation, which was based on studying the culture of female impersonators, what you might call drag queens in some contexts. And that was the first PhD dissertation in lesbian and gay studies in any field that was ever published. Okay? It's still worth going back to. It's still a great little study. It's a little bit old-fashioned in some way. But it is the first. And she worked with a guy called David Schneider, who I said did innovative work in kinship. The field really started to develop, and like many fields of sexuality studies, it really started to take off in the late 1980s, okay? Where people, often who were gay or lesbian themselves, started to research their own communities and used the tools of anthropology, like participant observation, but used it to produce very different kinds of accounts. So, for example, one such account is Ellen Lewin's book on lesbian mothers, right? So I'll talk about this more in a bit when I talk about psychology. But sort of from the 1970s on, as lesbians often became lesbians in the course of separating from a heterosexual marriage, often had children, and often their sexual orientation was used against them in court to deny them custody of their children. So this became a national issue. So Ellen's work sort of looks at the struggles and the narratives of women who are in that kind of position, right? Who have children from a previous marriage, which is really quite interesting and complex and lovely. And then this book, which was published in 1993, which was an ethnography of really lesbian and gay people living in San Francisco, is called Families We Choose, and was quite innovative in making clear that actually what lesbians and gays are doing in contemporary modern societies is changing the rules of kinship. Okay? So if you accept that there are things like kinship and they have rules, they're changing them. So one of the things that happens when people come out is they realize that those natural bonds of kinship may not be so natural after all. They might be quite social. They might be quite precarious. They might be quite contingent, right? They might go away, right? So there's nice and wrenching stories in there about what do you do if you live in San Francisco and you have to have that dilemma of do you go home for Christmas? Who do you go home as? Which part of you can go home? Which part of you can't go home? When you have to go back and do that big family thing, are you there or are you not there? How are you there? Also, what was happening at this point in time was the in vitro fertilization revolution had happened. And so single women who were not in marriages were able to, and were increasingly having children on their own. So by about 1990, people were estimating that about 3 to 5 million children were being raised by lesbian mothers in the United States. And similar stuff was going on in the UK as well, and Ireland was not well researched. So Kath Weston talked about this, obviously being a way of very materially making up new kinds of kinships, and the ways in which men were inserted into those relationships. So many lesbians wanted to use gay men who are friends of theirs as sperm donors, but this is also the 1980s when sperm is quite dangerous, and the sperm of gay men is particularly dangerous. So questions about do you trust HIV tests or not, and how do you construct biological relatedness are very much in the lives of these people. So all of this work is to say that by studying gay and lesbian cultures in their own right, and sort of getting voices from within, anthropology, that was sort of part of the process by which anthropology became a more reflexive discipline, by which it stood back and gave us an account of culture that involves all of us. So do I have more on that? No, so that is what I want to say about culture. Again, sort of just that question of sort of reflecting back, the idea that our disciplines kind of give us ways of looking at things, give us ways of objectifying things, right? And it can be as simple, of course, as using that word subject or client. Once you do that, somebody is in a role, right? And they do things. And once we're in roles, off we go. Nobody told you to sit there quietly and listen to me all day, right? Okay, but somehow you did that because we got into a role, right? Nobody told me to bring PowerPoints, but I would have been out of role if I hadn't done it, right? So those things make a difference. I flew in yesterday and I got a taxi over here, and the taxi driver said to me that I told them what I was doing. I didn't tell them it was an LGBT thing, because that can make a taxi ride very long. I played it low risk and said, I'm going to go and talk to a group of psychotherapists. And he went, oh. And I said, I'm not a psychotherapist. He went, oh. He said, well, whatever you do, he said, don't tell them any new theories. I thought that was interesting. This is the social psychology bit. This is what I actually do. This is what I'm actually supposedly trained to do with social psychology. And I have to say, there were all sorts of times in my life where, in the psychology department, where it's like, people get very hooked up on like the neuroscience thing, or they get very hooked up with clinical psychology things, because like neuroscience is the big wingding, big science thing, and clinical psychology gets loads of money from the NHS. And sometimes you're like, social psychology, you have a bit of self-doubt, you think you're being relevant. All you have to do is get in a taxi in Dublin and have a conversation. And no matter how it pans out, you walk away and think, do you know what? There is a reality to social psychology. So this next bit is for the taxi drivers. And we'll come back to this guy in particular by the very end, who is rather fabulous. So as I mentioned, we are kind of in a process of historical change. We have been in a process of historical change. And psychology gets sort of bound up with that in lots of interesting ways. So psychologists influence history, and history influences psychologists. We can only study or help or work with the people who exist in our own historical time. We can't work with my uncle. And at the same time, what many of us are trying to do is bring about some kind of change, like your landmark training event. You're trying to change how student counselling is going to be done. So you're trying to make that. A sort of landmark moment in social psychology where these things came together was the decision in the 1950s to desegregate American schools along lines of phrase, known as the Brand versus Board of Education decision. And these psychologists, Kenneth and Mandy Clark, gave expert testimony in the US Supreme Court in favour of that decision. That overruled an earlier ruling from the very late 19th century. And the logic of it was, do you know what? You can't actually separate out kids and have that be equal, right? You can't actually do separate is inherently unequal. And so this becomes very important. It becomes the context within which psychologists are very jazzed about writing about prejudice and prejudice reduction and how to change it. And in particular, this psychologist, Gordon Allport, writes this book, The Nature of Prejudice, around this time, 1954, in which he argues that this is going to be great, desegregation is going to be great, because what people are going to do is they're going to have contact with somebody from the other group. Right? Instead of being strangers, they're going to have contact. And he specified some conditions under which contact would reduce prejudice and would create warm feelings between people who previously their groups had been positioned in some kind of relationship. And so there was lots and lots and lots and lots of work on this afterwards. And it wasn't simple, as these two images kind of show. Of course, whites in the southern part of the United States resisted integration very, very hard. So much so that this federal law had to be imposed on the states, right? So they had to bring the army in. There was, some very, very strong protests and all the rest of it. Now, I just mentioned that kind of protest and all of that because that's actually kind of relevant to what's going on in the US about LGBT as well. It provides an analogy and the beginnings of an understanding of it. So, of course, in the 1950s, nobody was thinking about homophobia as prejudice. Right? We didn't even have the word homophobia. That was kind of developed on the streets in New York, very, very late 1960s, and then popularized in a book by a straight psychologist who knew lots of gay people. His name was George Weinberg. He wrote it in 1973 and said, do you know what, if a straight person is afraid of gay people, I would never consider them mentally healthy. They have homophobia. Right? So using the language of mental illness, apologize prejudice. But it's not that in the 1950s. We were writing things like DSM-1 in 1952, which codified the idea that homosexuality was a mental illness. That's where the mental health professions were. And there was very, very little opposition to that, or if there was opposition to it, then you were probably being investigated by the federal government because you were doing that research. But lo and behold, of course, this all kind of grows and develops, and so we get to the early 2000s, and these two psychologists, Thomas Pettigrew, who was actually one of Allport's students, and Linda Tropp, who was a contemporary of mine, we did our PhDs around the same time and used to go to conferences and be scared together when we were PhD students. And they did this huge meta-analysis, which is where you kind of quantitatively draw together a very, very large bunch of studies. And in this analysis, what you can see, of course, this contact hypothesis has been applied to many, many different kinds of groups over historical time. So things like, range of groups, stereotypes of elderly people, mentally ill people, mentally disabled people, race and ethnicity, which of course was the original interest, physically disabled people, and sexual orientation. So it's been extensively tried in Northern Ireland and Israel, Palestine, lots and lots of different places. And there were just thousands of studies. Completely surprisingly, nobody would have predicted this. They didn't predict it until they sat down and ran the numbers. Contact breaks down sexual orientation prejudice more than it breaks down anything else. So yes, it's really good to have conversations with people who are different from you, but that formula really, really works out at sexual orientation. Okay? Nobody predicted that, right? Nobody would have been thinking that in the 1950s because we live in history, right? But by the time they did it retrospectively, in my research group, we've been looking at this from a slightly different vantage point. It's my PhD student, Sebastian Bartos, who's from Romania. And he has done a large meta-analysis looking at all the studies that we've done since the 1970s, where psychologists have tried to do some kind of an intervention to reduce people's homophobia. And the most common thing that you see in the literature is what he calls a contact plus education, right? Where you have something like a speakers panel of people come out and kind of tell their stories about being LGBT in a classroom, and people do some kind of measure of attitudes before and afterwards. And this reliably has an effect and reduces prejudice on standardized measures by about half a standard deviation. We've loads of these studies. So from different vantage points, we can see that contact really, really works. Now I want you to hold that thought, because by the end of this this session, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the same-sex marriage campaign in Ireland, which really understood this. They were really, really good social psychologists, really, really good social psychologists, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. But one of the things the Yes campaign did was rely very, very heavily on the idea of contact, right? Going out, going door to door, talking to people, and making sure that people then talk to people in their families, what social psychologists call extended contact, right? So I might not be a friend of our group, but I'm a friend of you and I know you're a friend. I still get a bit of that effect, right, in terms of prejudice reduction. I also mention this because we haven't done this very much around gender minorities, okay? I did a study in Britain and the student was told, actually you can't publish a psychological study on trans because it's a sociological issue. That was 2006, right? We're not there now, right? We're not there now, things have opened up, but we really had to push that one through publication. So we're kind of, contact I think can change things. One of the ways that does that, right, and one of the things that's in the experience of contact is that intergroup anxiety goes down, right? So a lot of people feel anxious when they meet somebody from a group that's different from them. They don't know what to do, they don't know what to say, this may be a scary encounter for them, there may be a history of hostility, or they may just feel they're going to be impolite, okay? All those things are a form of distancing and a form of othering. And those get broken down when people do perspective taking, right? When people do empathizing, when people can see things from another point of view. This also, emerging from Sebastian's work, seems to reliably reduce prejudice, things that are manipulations of empathy and perspective taking. Now, I'll just show you one that I did with the Trinity group last year, and I won't ask you to do it, but I will show you some typical kinds of responses that people come up with at the end of it. So you've had bad old-fashioned anthropology, you're about to get bad old-fashioned science fiction, okay? So you can let the brain rest for a minute. Here's a little funny story coming in. Okay, so this is something that I've done in classrooms with great success. I find it just really creates empathy and works brilliantly. I do it as an LGBT specific exercise because usually that's what it's embedded within, but other people do it in other contexts. So my sister Therese Hegarty, who teaches trainee teachers in Maynooth University, does this, and it's not specifically LGBT thing for her. So take this, steal it, use it, it kind of works, right? So you get students to read the following story. Imagine that you've crash landed on an alien planet, Aurora, along with 3,000 other students. The inhabitants of this new planet, Aurora, appear remarkably Earth-like and friendly. They speak English, and it's impossible to look at someone and tell if they're an Earthling or if they're from Aurora. You also learn that the Aurorans live only in same-sex housing and that their children are produced under strict government control in a laboratory via artificial insemination. In some, the public or private display of affection is strictly forbidden, and the consequences for violating these norms appear severe. To illustrate the severity of punishment for violating the Aurorans' cultural norms, you hear that 2 Earthlings sitting in a restaurant holding hands were beaten and run out of the establishment. Another Earthling who kissed someone on the cheek in public was reported missing the next day and has not been heard from since. You become angry and go to the local government to voice a complaint. After you present your case, 2 guards, I love that they're guards, actually I hadn't thought that before, that's great. Two guards rough you up and throw you out on the street. One says quietly in your ear, if you're smart, you won't bring that kind of thing up again. Despite these problems, the Aurorans express a desire to welcome you to their planet. They provide each of you with an apartment, a job, and a small car. Unfortunately, your spaceship was damaged beyond repair, and the Aurorans do not have advanced technology for space travel. All hope of escaping from the planet is gone. You also learn that the planet's only hospitable landmass is approximately the size of Texas, or France, if that's easier to visualize, with similar numbers of inhabitants in urban, suburban, and rural areas. Now you must decide what you'll do on Aurora, right? Then, as the Trinity people in the room who are smiling, we'll break into groups and kind of come up with strategies for about 15 minutes, and then we would discuss them, okay? Now, I'm not going to show you what the Trinity people came up with. They did surprise me in some ways. Yeah, you did. Can I say what you surprised?
I think you told us at the time.
Yeah. They were really happy with martyrdom strategies. You were all going to die for the cause.
Not all of us.
Not all of you, but I a lot more than anywhere I'd ever seen. I don't know if that's a Dublin thing, I don't know if that's a Trinity thing, I don't know. Maybe it was a kind of like 1916 awareness thing, I don't know, right? Bit of a Porrick Pierce effect there, but anyway. So this is just, I mean, some of the representative things when I did this with a class of undergraduates in Surrey several years ago. And I've done this, so what we did in this class, because they were, you know, they had learned a good bit of social psychology, is we started to separate them out into intergroup strategies, right? So there's a set of strategies that are about assimilation, right? So this is me as an undergraduate, right? Do nothing, commit suicide, right? Which is a concern, right, for students. And is a concern for this group, right? The suicide risk is elevated. And if they can't feel affection, we should go for acceptance and social change. So basically, I am just going to do everything to contort and fit myself into this new world. And I'm not going to ask anything, because that's just way, way too scary, right? And that's a way of doing it. And lots of people choose that strategy in lots of contexts over the short term or the long term. Then there's a set of things that we end up calling separatism, which is like we're going to go off and do our own thing. Try to live in a separate community, subculture, a human compound, or on a corner of the island, or in the sewers outside of society and the law. Or some kinds of separatism that are a bit more temporary, like developing a secret language so that you could have code words. And then developing earthling saunas and nightclubs that won't be approved of the government, but, you know, might be quite fun. So again, strategy is about sort of getting away, right? About either they're having a temporary, a permanent release from this strange oppressive system that, from the oppressor's side, feels welcoming, but actually undermines who you are at a very fundamental level and something that feels very central to your being. And then other groups come up with more transformative strategies, right? So things like find the critical intellectuals who challenge the status quo. Learn about Aurora. Is it natural for them to be non-affectionate, or is it a dictatorship? Now, this is a really interesting one. So lots of people kind of go there with the nature-nurture question, right? Back to the screwdrivers, right? Is it natural for the Auroras to be like this, or is this some kind of political ideology that's been imposed on them? If we can figure out that question, then we'll know our strategy. Interestingly, nobody in the Earthling minority group ever says, it would be great if they asked the nurture-nature question about us, right? Everybody wants the nature-nurture question to be asked about somebody else, right? It's not empowering to have it asked about you. It's empowering to ask it about other people, right? To get back to the Nasimera. Get secretly pregnant and increase the Earthling population, right? That's good. But very risky, right? Very risky. Pregnancy is obviously going to be a sign that you've broken the law, because how else did you get there? One thing that heterosexual people are good at is getting pregnant by accident, right? Okay. When we get to the discussion of what it is that might mean that the rational basis for why heterosexual relationships should be recognized by the state, but same-sex relationships shouldn't, we have to think about what heterosexual people can do that same-sex couples can't do. The list is very short, and really it stops at having children by accident. There is nothing else. There's nothing else you can do, right? That's what it's about. So this is important. And also, once we start to think about reproduction and children, and we start to think about how our political strategies are not just enacted for us, but for our children or some imaginary future generation, then people start to realize that actually as Earthlings, they might not have children. So they might be the one and only generation of Earthlings on the planet, on this planet, right? When they die, it's gone, and we're back to all Aurorans again. And that changes your political strategy. That changes your intergroup relations. And you suddenly start to realize, actually, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for some imaginary child in the future. Okay? That usually changes the conversation when we realize that and that penny drops. And I think when you see that, then you can start to see, ooh, how really unjust it is to use sexual orientation as a basis for taking people's children off them, right? As has been happening. Or how unjust is it to have a conversation at a national level that you can't have same-sex marriage because then same-sex people would be raising children? How inhumane is that? Take drastic measures, terrorism, hostage-taking of high-level government officials, destroy the artificial insemination bank, take the Auroran children and hold them to ransom. Now, one of the reasons that this works really well, right, is when you teach around issues around diversity and questions about power come into the room, it can be threatening to people, right? We'll talk about the psychology of that threat by the end. And people can get defensive and they can kind of retreat in, right? When you do this with students, those students who might do that retreat in and they become total terrorists, right? And once they've had that experience of being complete terrorists for the Earthlings as this embattled sexual minority who want their rights to sexual expression, they've empathized. And you've done the empathy manipulation. So once you've done this, that's all changed. So you've changed people and you've done that half a standard deviation that Sebastian is talking about. It also means what you've done is you've now given people a shared experience, right? Everybody's been to Aurora together, right? And I don't know if this happened in your group, but you can talk about it afterwards, right? And you can refer back to Aurora in later conversations. So in a classroom context over a long time, or if you're going to work with a group over a long time, this is a great intervention. Because it gets us away from, oh, I'm heterosexual, so I can't possibly say anything like that, or the LGBT people will beat me up for being ignorant, right? And I've just only come to university and I'm really scared. Gets you past that. It also gets you past the kind of, I came out and I'm fabulous and I know it all. So I'm just going to speak for everybody in my group now because my experience is everybody's, right? Gets you past that one, right? Because you can go to, I don't know, what you, in psychotherapy, might call a third, right? There can be an object that you can talk about, that you've shared, that you've had a group experience about, and you can go back to Aurora and you can use that as your springboard for talking about other things. So if one of the things that made you feel very other in North America was that sense that you had to talk about your experience an awful lot more in the classroom than you were really comfortable doing, and that made you feel very Irish and do a lot of like, when those kinds of conversations came around, this is great, right? Because it gives you a virtual experience, a little science fiction experience that's a little bit distant that you can play with. These are also, of course, great for teaching about history, right? Because these are all strategies that LGBT people have done at various points in time, right? So you can look at all of these things and say, yeah, you can think about people doing nothing, you can think about suicide rates, you can think about fitting in, you can think about separatism, you can think about sex clubs, you can think about secret languages, right? Like hanky codes or red neckties, or saying, are you a friend of Dorothy, or do you happen to be musical, or those kinds of linguistic and paralinguistic cues that people have sort of used to establish those little moments of society over time. You can certainly find the critical intellectuals, right? Where has the LGBT movement happened first? What leads it? Universities, where the critical intellectuals are, where people value open-mindedness and sitting and thinking differently and will spend the time to do it. You can learn about Aurora. Yeah, absolutely. We need to learn about heterosexuality. We need to think about heterosexuality and think about it as a thing rather than just society, you know? Pick up a lads mag, you know? Think about how young men are being socialized into heterosexuality. It's really different than it was before FHM started publishing in 1994, okay? And it's different again now because it's hipsters with beards and craft beers who are into consumption and taste in ways that would have been seen as very effeminate even in the mid-90s to the early 2000s, right? Heterosexuality is a thing. It moves too. It's got a little pink screwdriver all of its own. You know, obviously getting pregnant can be seen as a political act if society tells you that you can't do that. Here's what: expose the Aurora to affection. If they liked it, maybe they would spread the word. So you can always try and straight people gay. Lots of people have tried that with varying levels of success. I could tell you stories. And you know, take drastic measures like terrorism. And once people have sort of understood that, as I say, they have an empathy and a better basis for understanding quite radical forms of politics and quite angry forms of politics that otherwise they might dismiss a little bit too quickly. So there is, so this is a technique that was developed by two psychologists in the US called Hillman and Martin. There's a couple of little papers on its effectiveness. A few people have done experiments on it. I've never really done any experiments on it myself. I've always just used it as an educational practitioner. With a student that I'll talk about later, we did try and develop a trans version of this, but we didn't really fully develop it, where you kind of land and you're in this spacesuit that kind of gives off a cue about your gender that's wrong. And anyway, we never quite got it, but we're sort of there in history, and I think we probably do need to develop one of it that's about gender rather than about sexuality. Or maybe adapt that in such a way that we can make it more about gender, because that's a big part of the work we need to do. So just a couple of little objects to kind of get you thinking about how there is always knowledge in the intellectual communities of minority groups about this kind of othering, right? About this way that you were kind of excluded from the norm from the start, and so you're made into a bit of a spectacle. So you're both erased and made a spectacle at the same time. So, so for example, in the 1970s, again, and you can, if you sort of dig into gay lesbian archives, you can see lots of people developing this idea of a heterosexual questionnaire. And a heterosexual questionnaire is a set of questions that you can ask heterosexual people that you can't really ask heterosexual people, right? So things like, what do you think caused your heterosexuality? The nature-nurture question. When did you first decide you were heterosexual? And that sort of thing, right? And they kind of get a little bit more accusatory as you go on. The idea being that what this is trying to do is to interrupt the norm that these are legitimate questions to ask lesbian and gay people. That's what people were trying to use this for in the 1970s, to get people to think, oh, okay, the norms are not equal, the norms are unfair, right? They're unfair, they're stacked against something in favor of others. A colleague of mine, Eric Manalastas, who teaches LGBT psychology in the Philippines, does something quite creative with this. He gets students to develop questions they want to ask lesbian and gay people, then change them to questions about heterosexual people. Then they have to go out and ask heterosexual people those questions, have embarrassing failure moments, and write about it, right? So it makes you break the conversational norms, be impolite, really put this into practice, and then you see the structure of politeness in society, okay? So that's one from LGBT cultures. One a little bit later on from the 90s. So this is the academic Jacob Hale, who I think is now at Leeds University, somewhere in the north of England. And he came out with this set of rules for non-trans people writing about trans people, trans topics. Nowadays we might use the word cisgender, but we didn't have that word then because we were in a different point in history. So this was kind of in response to the fact that this historian of science, Bernice Hausmann, had written a book about the science of transsexualism, but hadn't actually talked to any trans people in the course of writing that book, okay? So he says things like, approach your topic with a sense of humility. You are not the experts about transsexuals, transsexuality, transsexualism, or trans, whatever transsexuals are. Again, this language may not be the language we use now because this is in history. Interrogate your own subject position. Beware of replicating the following discursive movement: initial fascination with the exotic, denial of subjectivity, lack of access to dominant discourses, followed by a species of rehabilitation, right? So I think trans is really fascinating. I think it would really prove that gender is all really socially constructed. And I feel that's good because actually I think genders are too restrictive for everybody. So trans people are a really fascinating version of that. And they're quite strange, really, aren't they, trans people? And so they're really strong evidence of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write about some trans people, but I'm not going to actually ask any of them if that would be a good idea for me to do. I'm just going to presume it's a good idea because I'm a nice middle-class person in a university, so we just do good things. And actually, lots of trans people have had difficult lives, so they don't get to be nice middle-class people in universities, or if they do, they've gone through a hell of a way to get there. And I should really be talking to them, but I haven't bothered because I have to write this quickly. So I'm going to write it, but I'm going to say nice things about them in a kind of slightly pitying kind of way, and that's kind of going to be good because that's what nice middle-class people do in universities, right? So what Jacob Hale is saying, like, had enough of that, thanks? Yeah, no. So pushing the standards of how you think about it. So I think, you know, one of the things that you need to be aware of, particularly, is that in trans movements, this ethos of sort of nothing about us without us is particularly strong, right? Particularly strong at this point in time. So, you know, there would be colleagues of mine who would say, you were supposed to go to Ireland and talk about LGBT. Like, how are you going to do that as a gay man? That's really not cool. That's why are you getting up there and speaking about that? You know, so you've got to realize that that ethos is very, very strong. So actually all kind of groups who have been discriminated against, who've been targeted for one reason or another, have a version of this kind of understanding about norms and others, right? That the dominant group is taken to be just the norm, just who people are, just the people who do good stuff and who have knowledge and all of that. And other people get positioned into the position of being the other, the exotic, the forgotten, the spectacle, the nasimera, right? So you can go back to Hegel's dialectic if you want to, or Marx's interpretation of it about class, right? So that the middle class constructs the world and nature in their own image and in their own interests. And so that's in tension with the ways of being of the working class, with whom they are utterly interdependent, right, in the Industrial Revolution. And that's going to lead to tension, and that's going to lead to revolution. This is in the writings of somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American scholar writing The Souls of Black Folk in the first decade of the 20th century, where he talks about double consciousness, right? This idea that as a black man in the United States, you need to have two consciousnesses, a consciousness of yourself as black and a consciousness of yourself as American. You need two. Whereas if you're white, he wouldn't have used this word, this is my term, you just need a single consciousness. A single consciousness will do, right? Because white and American kind of mean the same thing. Simone de Beauvoir has this all over the second sex, the foundational work of modern feminism, particularly when she says things like, it's not the case that a male writer ever needs to announce himself as a male writer. He can just be a writer and it's obvious that he's male, right? So on the problem of writing as a woman. This is all over Foucault's idea, if you want to get postmodern on it, on disciplinary power. And this is what we do, right? Because a lot of what we do as psychologists is we, in our discipline, write about other people. And typically, we write about people more if they have less power to begin with, right? We kind of write about the intelligence of children more than the intelligence of adults. You write a lot more about your clients who are perhaps in some trouble and come to your door than the students who never come to your door, right? And that question of who gets written about, and once you get written about, then there's a set of documents about you. And once there's a set of documents about you, that objectifies who you are, so other kinds of power can work on you, other kinds of institutional power can work on you, okay? And we do a lot of this in our work in terms of safeguarding, but therapists who are influenced by Foucault, such as narrative therapists, would suggest that we work against those kinds of working with documents, right? And we do other kinds of more radical things, and that's what they experiment with dangerously. And of course, this is also embedded into the idea of heteronormativity, that society is and should be always and definitively heterosexual. So for the social psychology bit, before we break for lunch, I'm going to finally show you some experiments that I've done. This is my actual job. It's the thing that they call me doctor for. To show you how, in our thinking, we do this very spontaneously in our relationship to power, right? It's something that we've learned to do. I'm going to start with this riddle. Some of you will have seen this before. This is quite well known. And the riddle goes like this. This morning, a man and his son were driving to work. They were driving along the highway when they had a terrible accident. The man was killed outright, but the son was still alive, although badly injured. The son was rushed to hospital and was to have an emergency operation. On entering the operation theatre, the surgeon looked at the boy and said, I can't do this operation. This boy is my son. Right, so this is the riddle. The riddle is what's the relationship between the surgeon and the boy? Mother, right, okay. So I'm giving this riddle to students in the University of Surrey at the moment in the course of a larger set of experiments. About 60% of them don't guess that the surgeon is the mother, okay? And other people have done that in other universities recently and they get a similar rate. So some people are going like, oh! So if you went to kind of biological adopted dad or two gay dads, or one of them's really a priest and that's what father means, or one of them's a ghost that rose in the grave, people have done all those kinds of things before you in our lab in the University of Surrey, right? And the reason is that this story is actually very well constructed, and it hinges on this word surgeon, right? Now, we all know that women can be surgeons, right? We are not, sexist dinosaurs from before the dawn of Queen Victoria. And, I did this on a friend of mine over dinner once, and we were like, hey, his sister is a surgeon. And still he was blanking on it, right? It's amazing how blind this can be. Because once you establish that mental image that in your mind of a surgeon as being male, it's very hard to shift that person's gender, right, in your representation of that story, right? And that's why this is a particularly good Good one. So I'm all about how we do that, right? How, at a social psychology level, that's how I think what's going on in our thinking at a cognitive level that makes this form of power, this form of othering, so smooth, right? So smooth that we can just read the Nassimera script and we form the mental images and we're off. Or we read the surgeon riddle and we get confused and we don't know why, right? And it's because of the way that words conjure up what in olden times we called mental images, what these days cognitive psychologists might call a representation in working memory, of who people are that are doing particular kinds of things. So I have a line of work where I've been looking at the fact that once you construct these kinds of things, they have an effect on how you then reason about differences within a group, okay? So an old experiment from about 1990 showed that if you ask students in America to think of a typical American voter, and then to write a paragraph about that voter, most people will call to mind a man, right? Over 90% of students would do that, including over 90% of women students. And men and women vote in roughly equal numbers in the US, right? There's a small gender difference, but it's really small. It's just that that word voter actually functions a lot more like surgeon than you might think, right? Experiment number 2. You give students a gender difference in voting behavior, right? You say more men voted for this candidate, more women voted for this candidate. Why do you think that was? Explain that difference in your own words. What people do when they get that is they focus their explanations on how women are different from men a lot more than how men are different from women, right? So people are, in this experiment, about 5 times more likely to say, well, women will vote for the Democrat because they're more liberal, than they are to say men will vote for the Republican because men are more conservative. It's a 5-to-1 ratio. When I say this to people, they largely sit there and say, I don't care. This is irrelevant. I've got suicidal students on my watch. What the hell are you doing, right? But this actually matters. And it matters because, apart from anything else, it's in our science, right? So this is a study I did 10 years ago with a student called Karen Buchel, where we went through 40 years of journals in psychology. We took 4 journals and went through 40 years, and we looked at the results and discussion sections where gender differences were observed, right? When gender was not the salient topic, so it's not mentioned in the title or abstract, there is very little talk about gender. But when it's mentioned in the abstract, or it's highly salient because it's mentioned in the title, you can see that there's a difference. People are talking about how women and girls are different from men and boys more than the reverse, okay? That's not as big an effect as you get in experiments, but it is a reliable effect. This is happening as much in articles that are written by women authors as by men authors. It's happening as much in the feminist journal Psychology of Women Quarterly as it is in non-feminist journals. And it's happening as much in 2004 as it is in 1965. Now, during that time, feminists made lots of important innovations in the way that psychologists write in their scientific style, but this was not on their radar screen very much, and this didn't change at all over 40 years. Okay? So this is a really kind of low-level kind of othering, right? This is not intentional, this is not conscious, this is not about malice, and this is not about promoting the needs of your in-group over some out-group. This is just a habit that we have, but it matters. Now, we've done loads of experiments on this, and it matters not just for gender, it matters for lots of things that are structured by power. So in the original studies, the original experiments, they looked at voting and sickness rates, and we looked at psychological literature, which covers just about everything, of course. In my PhD, I looked at sexual identity differences, so got people to reason about hypothetical differences between gay and straight men or lesbian and straight women. And there, by a ratio of about 3-to-1, people focused on how gay and lesbian people are different from straight people than on how straight people are different from gay and lesbian people. If this doesn't feel habitual yet, then you didn't remember that question, what are heterosexual people able to do that gay and lesbian people can't do, felt surprising to you. Right? That's the frame of reference for thinking about difference that we never use, right? And once you turn it around, you immediately see it's quite silly, right? We did this in the US with racial or ethnic differences by asking people to compare data between African Americans and European Americans. Mostly European American students in this study, and unpublished data we have suggests that African Americans do this, but they don't do it as much. And we looked at kind of everything in the race difference studies. So things like that are very stereotype relevant, like how much do these groups trust the police force? physiological things like whether each group is responding better or worse to blood pressure medication, success in drug rehab, which is kind of like a not so great thing, and rates of giving money to charity, which is definitely a pro-social thing. So positive, negative, stereotype relevant, stereotype irrelevant, 3 to 1, right? Black people are different from white people 3 times as much as white people are different from black people. Lastly, I did this with national differences, and it didn't work. So I did this with students in NUI Galway and in Surrey and got them to explain differences between Irish and British students in unhealthy eating or unhealthy drinking. Really, they didn't vary very much, but once you describe the Irish students as doing unhealthy drinking, then the old kind of Irish drinking stereotype really kicks in. But the norm thing didn't work. And so I think nations might be different from these kinds of differences that can sit within nations, but that may be a different story. So this effect matters because it's broad, right? You can generalize it to lots of different kinds of things that we care about that are basis of inequality. We've also done stuff with immigration and host populations, by the way. So that would be all very well if we just went around the place using language to other people and it didn't have any effect. But of course, those kinds of explanations of differences that are endemic in our science, that are not picked up by our standards of writing scientifically, objectively or fairly. There's nothing about this in the APA manual. That would be fine if they had no effects on the listener. Kind of maybe they'd be a projection of something, but they wouldn't have an effect. So my colleague Suzanne Bruckmuller did this for her PhD because she started to reason, well, actually, maybe these things have an effect on the listener. So to explain this, a little bit more cognitive psychology for you, here's 2 sentences, one of which sounds much sillier than the other. My bicycle is by the Cork Opera House, or the Cork Opera House is by my bicycle, okay? Both of these things are true. In fact, if one of them is true, the other one's got to be true, right? But you betcha, people are much more likely to say this than this, right? Okay, so the way that you frame things in sentences has a little bit of meaning in it, doesn't it? So we're going to call this thing the figure, right? The thing that's the subject. And we're going to call this thing the referent, right? Because that's what they do in psycholinguistics, because they're a little bit influenced by Gestalt psychology. And so Lila Gleitman, in early work, kind of showed that actually you can do this with nonsense-similar syllables. So you tell people either Dax is similar to Zum, or Zum is similar to Dax. There's no semantic meaning in those words, right? They're completely neutral. You've never heard them before. And they have implications, right? People think that Zum is larger and more immobile and probably more important than Dax, right? And if you think about the Cork Opera House and the bicycle, you think that too, okay? Just linguistic framing makes a difference. So Susanna's insight was to say, oh God, Peter and Felicia and other people have been studying the way in which explanations of groups become very asymmetric in the scientific literature. That feels a little bit like othering, but actually reading from here, let's look at how people read those explanations and what inferences they make about real social groups when they do that. So in the first set of studies, Susanna did her PhD in Germany. She gave people a description of how law students were different from economic students, or how economic students were different from law students, right? Now, apparently Germans think that law and economic students have roughly equal power and status, right? It might be different in your campus, I don't know, but in Nuremberg, they have equal status, right? And so then she looked at she asked people how much they thought the different groups had power and status, had agency, so they were able to kind of pursue their own ends, and how much they were communal. And so communal traits are where we put other people's needs ahead of our own, right? And they're typical of people that we stereotype as having low power. So sure enough, when your group is framed as the referent, right, you're seen as having less power. You're seen as having less agency, and you're seen as being more communal. So when I describe how you're all different from them, they seem a little bit more powerful than all of you, right? Just that framing seems to be enough. Now, I don't care very much about law and economic students in Germany. I mean, I'm sure they're all lovely people, but it's not the burning inequality question of our day, right? But in later studies, Susanna went on to show how this does make a difference in terms of things that we might care about. So in one study, or in a couple of studies, she went out and she asked German people to write about either handedness or relationship status, right? And what you had to do is you had to either write about how your group was different from the other group or how the other group was different from you, right? So any left-handers here today? Left-handers? Good 10%, that's about right, okay. So left-handers, you would have to either write about, oh, terrible word to have in this sentence, how right-handers are different from you or how you're different from right-handers, okay? And this variable here that she measured is collective self-esteem. How good do you feel about being a member of that group? How good do you feel about being a left-hander, and how important is that to you? Left-handers feel worse about that when they have to write about how they're different from right-handers than how right-handers are different from them, okay? Similarly, when you do this, it doesn't have an effect on right-handers because they're the norm, so they're fine. Similarly, when you do this with relationship status, people who are in relationships, it doesn't make a difference to them. People who are single, if they have to describe how single people are different from people in relationships, that makes them feel worse about being single than if, yeah, okay, right. And you know, again, this is the nice, clever experiment that we can do that's all very reliable and lovely, but there's just really good examples of this in language, which we put in a teaching paper for this. So like, you can say to somebody in a slightly patronizing, I'm going to steal your experience kind of way, why are you so still single? Oh, what is it? It's a mystery, isn't it? You know, but you can't say to somebody, why are you still in a relationship? It's a mystery, you know. That's a harder one, right? You know, and there's lots of these examples. You know, I saw a thing on Facebook the other day for the nth time of like things that left-handers hate that they say. Number one of which is, you're left-handed, right? It's like, I knew that. I've been using this hand for some time. This is not new information, but thank you for making me feel very speckled. Now, I'd love to say that actually, you know, it was kind of through some big kind of like gay voyage of discovery about othering that I came to kind of interest in this. But it wasn't. It was the experience of being in the United States. It was that experience of, you know, walking into a supermarket, saying something, and then somebody saying, you're Irish. I was like, yeah, I feel like a 10-foot leprechaun now. Thank you very much. And Susanna would say the same. It was her experience of being German in the US and being, how do all German people think about this issue? And she's like, there's 80 million of us. I haven't consulted with everybody, you know. And it's that feeling of, for both of us, it was that feeling of sort of being other to the American norm that led to kind of interest in this topic. So let's have a look at the heterophobic taxi driver. This is something that was put out by the Halo Cabs in Dublin the day before the referendum on equal marriage, right? And they were offering to take people to the polling booths in Dublin for free if they were voting for equal marriage. So I just think this is a really nice example of somebody taking that idea about othering and doing a little intervention with it.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Why would you be marrying somebody from another planet, you know? Different, completely different world. Doesn't make sense. How's it going?
It's a bit confusing around here.
It is, yeah. How's it going?
How's it going, man?
Oh, how's things? How you doing? Hiya, John. What's the story?
Nothing much. Just driving around town taking care of business. And a stray couple in the back of the car, though.
You're joking.
And he was holding his hand, and then he went to kiss her on the cheek. And he kicked them out the red cow roundabout. Shocking stuff, they go. Still haven't got over it, like.
I wouldn't have them in the car, and that'd be the end of it.
Sure, if I knew they were straight before they got in, I would have just sailed past them, they go.
What did he say there?
Well, you see, you know, we don't normally take heteros in the car, you know?
Yeah.
I've nothing against them, don't get me wrong. I'm not a heterophobe or anything else, but, you know, it's just, you know, I've an uncle that's hetero, so, you know what I mean?
Hetero or homo?
Hetero, yeah. You know, I have an uncle now that's straight. And I don't talk to him that much now. I don't see him that much, you know, because he's a bit sort of overpowered, to be honest. You've always heard the saying Cain and Abel, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't Jane and Abel, you know?
See, no breeders.
Yeah, but it's the old heterosexuals, you know, it's just doing their own thing and then leaving other people to pick up the pieces.
Huh?
Breed, you know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't see what the attraction is.
Breed.
So would you have like sailors? Would you have a lot of contact with sailors? Like?
No.
Saddam Hussein and Hitler, whose kids were they? Mother and father were straight as far as I know. It's funny, I was just thinking about it now, this must be one of the straightest roads in Dublin. You know what I mean?
Not a straighter.
And was your man on the phone as well?
That's who that was. He's actually one of the
Oh,
fellas
you
down the
shite, yeah. So what's
Well,
the
yeah.
sleep lane?
That's going to be, you know, the
Okay,
photos on the
okay.
22nd. So if you pre-book a taxi with Halo, it's €15, the value of 15, they pay you a taxi to go to the Holland station.
Okay, so I've kind of given you a lot of reasons to think about things from a very different perspective. Hopefully, kind of what I've kind of wanted to do this morning is kind of get us to think that we do actually approach things from a particular perspective, right? And so we've looked at that historically, right? I've got you to think about how we might be thinking about history as inevitable, right? That it was inevitable that we'd get here, that it would just happen on its own, and that it just comes with some sort of causal force that doesn't involve people at all. And I've invited you to think about the fact that maybe some of our ways of thinking about sexuality in psychology, like our nature-nurture schema, just comes really, really quickly to mind. And that might actually be a schema that we like to apply to other people, but don't like to apply to ourselves. And that in that feeling, it might be telling us something about how that's quite an incomplete understanding of how things are. So we saw that with screwdrivers, and then we saw it again with Aurora, where the students wanted to kind of ask nature-nurture questions about the Aurorans, but didn't want the Aurorans to ask nature-nurture questions about them. We then kind of got into talking about othering in greater depth, and I gave you that example of the Nasamera, and I really wanted to go through that slowly and to feel it with you so that you could sort of have that experience of reading it twice, right? Of reading it once and kind of going with it, with the reading, and then reading it with a very different mental image in mind. So you can see how writing, in expert writing, can so easily presume who is the reader and who is being written about, and just presume that power structure because it's been stable for a really long time. Well, anthropologists have destabilized that and wouldn't write like that anymore unless they were really bad anthropologists. We haven't changed very much in psychology. And the experiments were designed to sort of really think about how some of the ways in which we might describe statistical differences in psychology, which we do a lot of, might be, on the one hand, a projection of what we think about who is the norm, but also might be interpreted as who has power. And so people might think that one group has more power than the other, depending on whether they're positioned as the referent or the norm. And that might make people feel bad or good about the groups to which they belong. So this is really part 4, the recent history of psychology. As I said, I'm writing a book at the moment that I hope will be short, usable by psychologists, and that'll be about the recent history of lesbian and gay affirmative psychology, which then became LGBT psychology along the way. One of my motivations for doing that is because I teach history of psychology to undergraduates. So I do the big course where we do Freud and Watson and Skinner and all that kind of stuff. And even with a really good book, the history of psychology tends to end in the cognitive revolution in the 1970s. And that doesn't do it very well because we don't live in the 1970s anymore, do we? Because neuroscience happened since then, and ethics happened since then, and feminism happened since then, and sexuality happened since then, and genetics happened since then, and counseling happened since then. And so we just don't live in psychology departments that are like they were in the 1970s anymore. So like some other people who are research active in the field of history of psychology, there's a bit of a turn towards recent history, towards looking at like what's happened in recent decades, sort of since the cognitive revolution has changed things. And so my attempt to look at LGBT psychology is really sort of part of that broader move in that field. This is one of the few areas in psychology where you can really start to pinpoint organizations making deliberate changes to change the way they do things. And so some of you may know that in the early 1970s, following the Stonewall riots, that small groups of gay and lesbian activists began to more vigorously protest the meetings of the American Psychiatric Association, which had held homosexuality to be a diagnosis. And that went on in actually started just before Stonewall, but went on until 1972. And then in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association had a vote of its members who voted by about 2-1, little like in Ireland last year, to depathologize homosexuality. The American Psychological Association quickly followed suit, and its Council of Representatives came out with this statement, which was published in American Psychologist in 1975. Homosexuality per se implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social or vocational capacities. Furthermore, the American Psychological Association urges all mental health professionals to take the lead in removing the stigma of mental illness that long has been associated with homosexual orientations. So my concern is that when I talk about history of psychology, it kind of comes up to about this moment, but some people in the room weren't born when this moment happened, so this is really quite historical and is getting more historical all the time. So I'm trying to see what happened after that. So there were some really useful, accessible, quantitative records of what research was being done around that time and that help us get a quick sense of that. So Stephen Moran is a very interesting character in this early history, and he writes a paper in American Psychologist in 1977 where he does a literature review looking not at the findings of psychological research but looking at the questions that psychologists ask. Remember again how much of this is about turning the gaze back and reflecting on the questions we ask rather than the answers we get to those questions. And so he looked at the research that was published towards the end of the period when homosexuality was a diagnosis and found just what are the questions psychologists are asking. A lot about diagnosis. How can you tell if somebody is or isn't a homosexual? Can you do that with a Rorschach test, for example? Questions about adjustment. Can the homosexual ever be well adjusted? Is that a possibility? Right, that's the research question. Special topics, which is kind of anything to do with gay, lesbian people and what we do. That wasn't to do with psychiatry. There are actually some initial studies of prejudice published in this period and attitudes and stuff like that. The term homophobia gets popularized about 1973, and quite a bit of interest in the nature-nurture questioning causes. Then several years later, a chap called Alan Waters, using the same kind of coding scheme for articles, does this again. And this is not, a vast ocean of historical time here, right? But things had just dramatically changed in psychology very, very quickly. Questions about a diagnosis, obviously gone. Questions about adjustment, rapidly gone down. Special topics, not so special anymore. Right now, there's lots of research starting to come up. And among these 166 articles, there's 12 articles about gay and lesbian romantic relationships, which is like totally unheard of before then, because they were considered to be symptoms of a mental illness. Research on prejudice is, of course, going up. And interestingly, we as psychologists get less interested in the nature-nurture questions. Okay? Now, counselling starts to become a bigger piece of the pie of psychology around this point in time. And there is a later review of the literature in counselling, specifically in the 1980s, which shows that it's all really focused on special topics and prejudice. It's all on these more affirmative kinds of topics. But this is what you could call a paradigm shift happening in science, right? This is where old questions are going away and new questions are coming on stream. So as I mentioned earlier on, this field gets rapidly sort of overtaken by the events of the HIV epidemic, which, when it comes along, is not well understood at all. And is quickly understood by biomedicine through a very normalizing frame. So actually, before we came to the acronym AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, one of the first terms that was put out by the Center for Disease Control in the United States was GRID, gay-related immune disease, gay-related, right, tying it to the group. And that label stuck for some time, even after heterosexual cases of AIDS had come to light, okay? So again, think about that question about othering and labeling that we talked about in the first half. Although this affirmative literature is growing, this in no way equips psychologists with the understanding or the knowledge that they need to tackle this epidemic or to make a meaningful contribution to it. And again, you see people like Stephen Moran particularly having a leadership role in American psychology in the early 1980s, doing things like writing articles about the mental health implications of an HIV diagnosis, which were really being so overlooked at that point in time. The focus was very much on biomedical understanding. That all started to change in the mid-1980s as the theory cohered around 1984 that this syndrome of diseases that makes up AIDS was caused by a single agent, a retrovirus that we now know of as HIV. Shortly after that, we start to see a test for HIV come into place. And now we have new social identities. We can be HIV positive and we can be HIV negative. And in gay communities particularly, both of those are very salient identities. In the heterosexual world, a lot of people are just presuming that they're HIV negative, even though they might not be, and dread to think about the possibility that they could be anything else. Over the course of the 1980s, HIV/AIDS really starts to become a major topic in psychology. The 80s is a really bad conservative period in American politics by lots of ways. Ronald Reagan slashes services for everything. Ronald Reagan slashes services for research. He's not even talking about HIV until the time that he gets to debate who's going to make money out of the test with the French government, and that becomes a dispute about who discovered the virus. So there's definitely neglect and definitely a bit of spectacle going on. Surprisingly, he puts together a commission of people to investigate this, and even though he stacks it with lots of conservative people, they come out with some quite progressive recommendations in 1987, saying that there should be funding for more AIDS research, that this is affected by stigma, that people with HIV need protection from discrimination, and there needs to be lots of involved, engaged community research. Unsurprisingly, psychologists are there. They're jumping in, new research projects, new agendas, right, in the late 1980s. So even though psychologists' relationships with funding and funding around mental health issues is quite poor in the 1980s, HIV emerges as a positive thing. And I think this is one of the reasons why at this point in time, these kinds of affirmative perspectives, which are still quite small, still quite marginal to the discipline, moved more into the mainstream, right? It's because of HIV and AIDS and the kind of challenges and opportunities that presented to psychology's field. The other thing that happened in the 1980s that made lesbian and gay affirmative perspectives more central to what American psychology really is legal activism. So in the American legal system, it's possible to submit something called an amicus brief, an amicus curiae brief, which is Latin for friend of the court. And professional bodies do this all the time. They do it usually to establish some matter of principle in the law, okay? And the APA, the American Psychological Association, really started to do this quite a lot in the 1980s. So all of these are available on the APA website. You can read them. You can read all the legal judgments. I've read a lot of them now, not all of them. And you can see that the APA really starts to engage in this form of legal activism again in the 1980s. Again, that's because it's quite a conservative time, and a lot of those amicus briefs are to do with issues around reproductive rights, women's right to choose, that sort of thing. This brown line here, or grey line, is the number of amicus briefs in each 5-year period that are specifically about what the APA calls sexual orientation issues. In every single case, the APA is coming in on a pro-gay lesbian side, every single case, right? And what you can see as well is that this occupies quite a bit of the APA's attention. So think about it, psychology, it kind of is about just about everything. Of all the things that the APA could decide to be legal advocates about, sexual orientation is the dominant one. And you can see that in very recent history, this is really spiking. And almost all of these are marriage cases, right, leading up to the marriage case in the Supreme Court last year. So by the time we get into the 21st century, sexual orientation is really the dominant way in which American psychology is using this amicus brief strategy and intersecting with the law, right? So if you're interested in psychology and the law and interested in history that way, neglect sexual orientation to the absolute peril of your analysis, right? There are some really important Supreme Court judgments that punctuate this history and give us a sense of the kinds of historical time that we're living in. Starting in the 80s, one of the first Supreme Court cases is this case of Bowers versus Hardwick. This is a sodomy case, right? So different states in the United States have sodomy laws at this point in time. Some of them apply to same-sex and cross-sex activity. Some of them just apply to homosexual sex. This case is from Georgia, which has a sodomy statute that just applies to, no, it applies to both homosexual and heterosexual sex. And the APA weigh in and say, this is really bad, this is bad law, this is discriminatory, this harms. This is going to problematize doing HIV prevention because this is going to enhance stigma and make people go underground. They lose, right? The sodomy law stands, okay? They do another couple of sodomy cases, they do some military cases, etc. They generally lose, right? They keep going, they keep going, keep going. They have a big win in 1996 in a case called Romer versus Evans in the Supreme Court. It's a discrimination case, and I might get to talk about it. Then they win really big in 2003 in a case called Lawrence versus Texas. So this is a case in the Supreme Court that overturns the earlier sodomy law. Both cases involve two men having sex with each other who are found to be doing that because the police break into an apartment because they make a mistake and break into the wrong apartment on a call, right? In this case this case overturned it. When it was overturned, Lawrence v. Texas institutionalized in American law an equal right to privacy about sexuality, right? It said these two men were having sex with each other, but having sex can be and is part of a relationship. And relationships should be private. And people should have a right to private relationships, whether they're gay or straight. And that was the legal principle that got established. Even though, if you actually looked into this case, it was pretty obvious that these two men were not going to get into a relationship with each other, right? This was definitely going to be like a one-night thing if you looked into it. And the judges knew that, right? And that's what was kind of fantastic about it because, you know, who amongst us has had a one-night thing that we thought was a one-night thing that actually developed into something more, right? You kind of don't know. That's it. It's about being open to another person, isn't it? So this, by establishing that right to privacy, that then lays the foundation legally for equal marriage, which is sort of what happens and occupies much attention in the 21st century. So that's where our history is. Now, in the 1990s is really the period where you start to see lesbian and gay psychology sort of come of age. And that's not my metaphor, that's actually somebody else's metaphor. And that happens because you see in 1991, there's like a special issue of the American Psychologist reporting on therapists' experiences of good and bad practices, the biggest survey ever done to that point in time, norms for how to do non-heterosexist research, norms for how to use non-heterosexist language, reports on this kind of legal activism. All of a sudden, this is at the center of things. And in various ways, heterosexism, homophobia, sexual prejudice, it's been called different things, but it starts to be taken very seriously by the United States government in the 1990s, and for a few different reasons. One is that a report comes out in 1989 showing that sexual minority youth are at enhanced risk of suicide. Okay? A report comes out from the Department of Health, authored by somebody called Gibson. And that report then inspires a lot of people to become very, very active in schooling to equalize that and to protect that, right? So then you start to see people doing audits of that, and all of a sudden youth suicide is theorized as an effect of homophobia, and that's a bad thing. It's been going on for a long time, right? You went to Aurora, and maybe some of you thought about killing yourselves there, right? Going on for a long time. But it became thought about as a national issue. Similarly, in the late 80s, they started to record bias crimes or hate crimes, and were surprised to find the frequency with which hate crimes were committed on the basis of sexual orientation. Right? So we start to get national law in the United States saying we've got to keep records on hate crimes and we've got to keep records on gay bashings, right, on anti-gay, lesbian hate crimes. So again, the state taking recognition of that in the 90s, and by the late 90s, things like the horrific murder of Matthew Shepard bring that to a much broader public consciousness, and then everybody knows about it. We also see from Sebastian's work, for example, that the 1990s, you see a lot more people doing these kinds of intervention studies just in the literature. Just as we count them over years, they go up, right? Yeah.
Does everybody know about the murder of Matthew Shepard?
Yeah, it was a horrific murder of a young man in Wyoming who basically was leaving a bar and was approached by two young men who took him out to a field and brutally tortured him and tied him to a post, and he died the next day. This is not the most brutal homophobic murder that I've heard about, and if you dig into this research, you will find such horrible things. But it was a flashpoint in the culture in 1999. It was one that sort of it got a lot of media coverage, it led a lot of people to an outpouring of sympathy with the family, with the LGBT community. It led to films, it led to plays, it led to a lot of cultural representations. A lot of campuses, students had candlelight vigils, that sort of thing. So it was the moment where this it entered popular consciousness that this was a thing. This was a thing, this happened, this was not okay. And this was kind of happening in small town America, right? This was sort of everywhere. Thank you, Angie. So that was going on. The legal strategy of the APA was going on. And also in the 90s, you start to see other kinds of approaches coming about, like more critical approaches, more feminist approaches, particularly in the UK. So the 1990s is really where you see a lot of publishing happening on this. A lot of books being published, lots of articles, lots of people doing PhDs, lots of people thinking about, APA publishes its first set of guidelines for LGBT clients in the 1990s. A lot of this kind of institutional activity really doesn't happen very, very much before then. It's much more...
Sorry, Peter, what's the intervention studies there?
So by intervention studies, I mean studies where somebody comes in and does some kind of intervention where they try and reduce people's homophobia, like an educational intervention or something like that. So those kind of diversity training stuff, you know. One of the things that I want to kind of pull out is that we've had a lovely time this morning kind of thinking critically about norms and kind of getting beyond our usual kind of ways of thinking. But when psychologists become activists and they have to engage with the state, they often have to engage with very, very powerful actors, and they have to argue against people who are not on board with that way of thinking, right? And it changes the nature of what they say. If I have a message today, if there's one thing I want you to sort of think about this research coming from the US, it's about the fact that it comes from this legal context, right? And just to give you a sense, so in the mid-90s, APA starts weighing in with amicus briefs on parenting cases. So these are cases typically, but not always, of lesbian couples who are raising kids, and then starts to weigh in on marriage cases in the 2000s. Just to give you a sense of what needs to be argued here, I'm going to talk about one of those first cases from 95, which is called Bottoms v. Bottoms, and it's in the state of Virginia. So Sharon Bottoms was a young woman. She entered a heterosexual relationship. She had a son. She left that heterosexual relationship. She started a lesbian relationship. At this stage, she was about 22. Okay? She was raising this kid with her lesbian partner. They had had a commitment ceremony that had no legal recognition whatsoever in the 1990s. The child's biological father was happy with this arrangement and thought the best interest of his biological son was in being raised by these two lesbians. Sharon Bottom's mother thought differently. She thought that this was an abomination, and she didn't want her grandson raised by a lesbian, even her own daughter. So she filed for custody of her grandson. She won it. She lost it to her daughter in a higher court, and ultimately this went to the Supreme Court in the state of Virginia. And that's where the APA weighs in. So when the APA weighs in on these kinds of cases, what it has to do is it has to establish that it's of no disadvantage to a child to be raised by a same-sex couple. And I know this issue all got aired again in the equal marriage debate here very recently. Now again, just think about what we've been talking about all morning, right? Because this is where the rubber is about to hit the road, right? How do you argue that, right? I mean, ideally, what I'd like to argue is to say, you need to prove to me that heterosexual parents can do something extra magically special that lesbian parents can't do, right? I'm going to presume equality, right? That's not the legal ground on which you're standing. You're guilty till proven innocent. So you have to use a much more conservative argument. So what the APA does here, as it typically does in parenting cases and it does in marriage cases, is it makes a kind of no difference argument, right? So we've got lots of studies that show that lesbians raise normal children, right? That's great, but what makes a normal child? Why would you want one anyway, right? And that definition of normal then also starts to get subtly conceded. So actually, in that case, like, we know these children are normal because they grow up and they go to school and they get good grades and all that kind of thing. Maybe we're comfortable with that definition of normal. And we know they're normal because they play with the toys and games that are appropriate for their gender. And we're comfortable with that definition of normal. And we know they're normal because actually they're no more likely than other children to grow up to be LGBT. Are we comfortable with that definition? No, okay. I mean, think about it, right? If I was to say to you, yes, of course, Jews can raise normal children because we know they grow up to be Christian. That sounds hideous and racist because it is, right? But that's what the APA legal advocate program, right? Now, I can see that, you can see that, critical psychologists can see that, sociologists can see that, and the Christian right can see that and make counter-arguments based on sampling and all sorts of funny things. So a couple of sociologists going into the marriage era made that argument and said, do you know what, actually we've looked at all these psychological studies and they're socially constructing reality. And actually there are some differences. So for example, girls who are raised by lesbians are a little bit more likely to be a bit more fluid in their interests and their occupational choices and stuff like that. I see that as a good thing. Yeah, that's great. And actually, a good longitudinal British study shows that actually those kids are a little bit more likely to be open to being LGBT when they get to teenage years. Unsurprisingly, they haven't been told it's an abomination. It's just what you get in heterosexual families most of the time. So when they made that critique, their sociological article then got captured and used in a pivotal case in Canada against gay marriage. And they had to write a legal document to say, no, 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 you're misinterpreting our work. So even though the APA is sort of using this very concessive argument, actually if you look at the other arguments that people used, they were not so safe, okay? So what I want you to understand is I've given you kind of a way of thinking conceptually about this stuff, but it's very different from what you see in a lot of psychological research. Because most psychological research is done in the United States, and it's done with an ear to the legal system and having to engage in that kind of debate. So it's not as progressive, it's not as challenging, it's not as forward-looking, it's not as think outside the box as what we were doing earlier this morning, all right? So that's my big historical point. And that sort of carries on into marriage cases as well. A lot of argument from the same. Another area where you don't see that argument applied is in popular media, right? Popular media is there to sell books, sell newspapers, and it's not necessarily there to enlighten anybody, to get people to think differently, or get people to a better ground of understanding. In the 1990s, when Angie and I were in California, there was a lot of media attention on nature stories, right? Stories about gay genes, gay brains, that sort of thing. And some people who were producing that kind of science went on to have very successful careers as popular scientists for the first time. That argument also began to interface with the law, in this case that became Colorado Amendment 2, but didn't work, right? So people tried to make this argument that if there's a biology to sexual orientation, then it's unchangeable, it's immutable. So it's more like being a member of an ethnic minority, right? That was the argument. And it didn't work. It didn't work. That ultimately became a case called Roman versus Evans in the Supreme Court that was thrown out because it was on grounds of prejudice. Now, in using this kind of coming-of-age metaphor, I actually wrote an article where I critiqued that coming-of-age metaphor. Because one of the things that coming-of-age does is it celebrates becoming an adult rather than a child, right? And it kind of values adults a little bit more than children, right? Which is a bit, maybe something we want to step back from. And in the LGBT psychology of the 1990s, this was kind of great if you were an adult and you were, if you were a lesbian mother, you were being represented and being advocated for. But what if you were the gender non-conforming child who was being implicitly positioned as not normal? Actually, psychiatry continued to pathologize gender non-conforming children, and the dominant treatment of them was a behavior modification approach, which was aimed at normalizing their behavior with systems of reward. The center for this was the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and there was some critiques of it, as there was in every single decade when this has been going on in the popular view. By the end of the 1990s, I think the nature story had kind of run out of steam. People were bored of gay genes and gay brains. So what do we do when we're bored of a nature story? We have a nurture story, right? Because we like to just change screwdrivers every now and then to keep selling newspapers. So this, by the end of the 1990s, you start to see nurture stories come up, right? Instead of, oh, wow, guess what we've just found out? Sexuality is all biological and fixed. It's like, oh, wow, guess what? We've discovered that idea that sexuality is biological and fixed is a myth. Remember that one we wrote 10 years ago? Well, it's not. And do you know why? Because it's really fluid. And it didn't become a story about men, it became a story about women who were fluid, flexible, changeable, kind of like sexy and interesting, a little bit mysterious and saucy. So this is from 2009 from the New York Times. This is a report on the new psychology of sexuality, a report on the work of two psychologists, Meredith Chivers and Lisa Diamond. This is was at one point in time anyway, the most frequently downloaded article from the New York Times site, okay? So there's a bit of an appetite for this, right? And just give you a sense of what kind of science people were doing in the early 2000s about this kind of fluidity. So this is from Meredith Chivers' work. And so she took men and women, or women and men, men and women, that's it, sorry, into the laboratory, and those men said they were attracted to women or men, so they were straight or gay, or they were attracted to women or men, so they were lesbian or straight, right? And then she made them watch lots of porn. And the porn was either of women getting it on or of men getting it on, right? And what these graphs are showing is the difference in the physiological genital response of women and men to watching to porn of women getting it on to porn of men getting it on. Now, what the graphs are trying to show you is that men who are attracted to women are indeed turned on by pictures of lesbians, and men attracted to men are indeed attracted more by gay men. Women, it's all in the middle. It's all quite flexible and fluid. Women don't really know what they want. They're just attracted to lots of things. Whereas men are really simple, and it's just like a button, right? Male sexuality is like you turn it on, you turn it off, it's up, it's down, it's very simple. You know, and I'm not even going to say what the transsexuals is about, because that was just egregious. Now, as a historian of sexuality, I'm not really interested in this as a claim about nature nurture. I am. But what I'm really interested in is, where are we in terms of pink screwdrivers, right? Where are we in culture that you can do this experiment? And I mean that you can actually do it, because I would really struggle to do this experiment on my campus for various reasons, even if I want to. And I've done some pretty weird things. But, you know, on your campus, could you recruit women to be volunteers in psychology experiments? And could you say, I'm going to bring you in, I'm going to show you lesbian porn and gay porn, I'm going to hook you up to something that's going to measure vaginal pulse amplitude, and you're going to lie in a darkened room with a psychologist while we do that. Okay? So we're somewhere in the culture where we can do that, right? Because you can show people porn in psychology laboratories for very discernible ways in history, right? In the 60s, you can show people porn in the laboratory when you're trying to turn gay people straight, and that's usually what it's done for. In the 1980s, you can show people porn in the laboratory if you're investigating whether porn makes men want to commit acts of sexual violence. In the 2000s, you can show women porn because it's kind of fun and cool and sexy and shows us an interesting nature-nurture story, right? So something has happened with our pink screwdriver so that we can tell a different nature-nurture story by then, right? So this is just a little bit of evidence that we kind of had our nature in the 90s, but I think in the 2000s we were really into nurture for lots of reasons. Pornography had become mainstream, greater internet access. Viagra was being marketed to women by the end of the 1990s, so there were financial drivers to make women think of their sexuality as both more performative and more flexible. And we had good evolutionary psychology stories that nice to tell us nice natural stories about gender difference. Towards the end of this time, after this time, as I say, we kind of move forward with the stuff about marriage. The APA comes out with a resolution on that. Some people doubt it. And I won't go over this legal narrative, but say we ultimately kind of got here by 2015, and federal cases struck that down. However, I don't want you to think that we're on some kind of inevitable march towards progress, right? Every time there's a step forward, there's often a reaction against it. In the world today, many people live in countries, and many of your students will come from countries that would make Aurora look quite attractive from a sexual orientation point of view. At the international level, there's a thing called the Iaucc principles, signed up to many people. Mary Robinson was one of the authors, that are a framework for LGBT rights. Some countries accept those, but typically African countries don't, typically Middle Eastern countries don't, and the Vatican strongly opposes them. Okay? So that's what's happening at an international level. So there is a divide in the world in terms of legal recognition. In the United States as well, you can see defensiveness, right? You can see reaction. So just as after schools were desegregated in the 1950s and some people in the southern states said, we're not doing that, there are people in some of the southern states who are refusing to give marriage licenses to same-sex couples, making it a question of whether they will impose federal law on the states as they did in the 60s after school desegregation. And I think one thing that can happen as well when you do see a majority group whose rights and privileges are challenged is people retreat into a defensive position or invent a new kind of defensive position. This is from the No campaign in Ireland last year. You probably all saw this in a zillion billboards and probably know the story that this couple didn't know their images were being used in it and then came out. But I think what's interesting about the No campaign is it made this argument that a child has a natural right to a mother and a father, which was a little bit invented, right? I don't remember growing up thinking about that I had a natural right to a mother and a father. I might have thought that was ordinary. I might have thought that was my experience, but I never thought I had a natural right to it, right? So one thing that can happen is when we equalize things in society, people start to tell new stories about nature, right? People invent new stories about nature, what nature is, what nature should be, as a form of defensiveness. It's something to watch out for. Lastly, and I won't say much about this, I'll just kind of give this over to Lisa, who's going to talk more about it. Treatments of children who may not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, or who may not identify with any gender, have been challenged and are changing in recent times. And I mean really recent times. So with a student of mine, we did a content analysis of the research literature on this in psychology going up to 2008. And we found little grounds for optimism that more humanistic perspectives were going to be coming in. It did seem to us that the biomedical approach was dominant. There was a lot of misgendering of those children. They were still being assumed to have a pathology. And moreover, the more cisgenderist, the more problematic articles were the ones that were most frequently cited. So there's no reason to think of optimism. But things have changed since then, and maybe Lisa will tell us about recent changes. So these graphs are drawn from a report that the National Union of Students in the UK put out last year. It's on the web. It's very useful and worth reading. And it shows, the extent to which things are equal for LGBT students in the UK at the moment. It's quite a recent survey. I've done campus climate survey quite recently on my own campus, and this was kind of published around the same time we did our campus climate survey. We didn't use these measures. We asked different kinds of questions for different reasons, but it resonated. So these are students who are heterosexual, LGB, frequency of name calling, harassment, threats and intimidation, and actual physical violence, right? This is kind of ordinary if you go out and sample the LGBT community, okay? Many people have an experience of a name-calling thing. You're called faggot across campus, you're called dyke across the classroom. Most people, that will have happened to them at one point or a time, and certainly if you sample older people, it will have done. These kinds of physical assaults are a minority experience, but they're frighteningly common, okay? They do really happen. They seem to particularly happen to gay men, right, more than other groups in the LGBT groups. Here's the one that really worries me, is when you start to look at this stuff and you start to look at trans students, the data start to look really scary, okay? And why would they not? We haven't done anything. We have chronically not done anything, right? There are none of those APA briefs are about trans issues. There isn't a single one. APA came out with its first statement on transgender in 2009, right? That's very, very recent history, okay? So we haven't made the world safe for trans people. We haven't done it. We profoundly haven't done it. If you think we've done it, then I didn't get the memo. I tried to write bits of the memo, but I definitely didn't get the memo. And I really don't want us to tip over into, okay, we've all learned the word trans now, so grand, job done, let's shift over into that other sense of historical complacency from we don't have to do anything to we did it all last Tuesday at 5 o'clock, right? So here's the data. Have you ever seriously considered dropping out of your course? If you're not trans, that's at 20%. If you're trans, that's at 50%. If you're the most cutthroat, managerial, capitalist, neoliberal university manager, that should really be worrying you because you don't want to lose any students and you really don't want to lose them for a reason like that, okay? But that's where we're at, right? That's the contemporary picture in the UK. And I imagine there's something of use there. In terms of how we understand this, I think in psychology, the dominant model at the moment is the minority stress model for LGBs, and I think it probably, we can weight these things differently, but we do know that people live in an environment where there's a lot of ambient prejudice, a lot of ambient norming. We know that it affects people's coping and emotion regulation, right? The coping mechanisms that we might use might be more short-term, right? We might like to go out for beer a little bit more than we go in a meditation course, okay, as our first instinct, right? Social interactional things might be different, right? We might withdraw from some kinds of social situations because we fear what might happen there. And there might be good reasons for that fear, or there might be bad reasons for that fear, but that's the thing about fear, sometimes you don't know. And there might be cognitions that go with that, like hopelessness and negative self-schemas that explain to us rates of depression, anxiety, and other kinds of things. So this is the minority stress framework. This has been the dominant framework for understanding differences in sexual minority health, which are increasingly including sexual and gender minorities since about 2004. So what happens when you change it? Well, what I would like to argue is that actually you can, with small groups of people, create quite big changes, right? So I was very fortunate. This is a project I was involved in 2008 and 2010. We managed to get some money from a very wealthy gay person and managed to run these summer institutes in the University of Michigan for about 50 young people who were going off on research careers in psychology. So they were PhD students, some of them were postdoctoral researchers, a few of them had just started their first lecturing job. And we hothoused them in Michigan for a week with 10 leaders in this field, right? Including some people whose research I've been talking about. And we did this in 2008, we did it in 2010. And I still hear from these people, do you know what I mean? And they still tell me weird and wonderful things that they're doing. And, you know, one of them got promoted yesterday and she put that on Facebook and that's great, you know? And they are all, it's interesting to watch their names kind of come up in the literature as collaborators with each other and so on and so forth. So after the institutes, we gave them a little survey to do and asked them what had changed. And I think there is something about getting people, to, again, a social psychological message, but we often think about historical agency as something that you have to do as an individual. And I think if there's one of the core messages of social psychology, it's that you can only do a little bit as an individual, but as a small collective, you can do an awful lot more than you might imagine, right? A lot more than you phenomenologically think is possible. So here are some of the things that people said at the end of the institute. So this is what happens when you break set, right? When you give people a week in a university where they're taken seriously as researchers, and being LGBT is definitely the most boring taken for granted thing about them, rather than something they have to actually worry about. I felt relieved and happy to find that the attendees were so interested in being collegial and that the institute faculty and support folks did so much to encourage that. I liked the connection made over meals, in the poster session, in the staying in the hotel, and in the regular suggestions to work and write together. Personally, I feel more legitimized to bring up LGBT issues during lectures as there is a lack of it. Initially, I thought my institution is supportive of LGBT issues. However, since I attended the institute, I feel that my current institution should provide even more teaching and support on LGBT awareness. My norm has changed. I thought I was happy, but actually, do you know what? That's not enough. After meeting with so many LGBTSI participants who were the only LGBT psychology, 160 scholars at their home institution, I feel that fortunate than ever to be at a place that values, embraces, and funds this kind of work. Of course, this institution is not perfect and could benefit from even more institutional change, but it's better than not having any support at all. I just realized how lucky I am. My norms have changed. Okay? Now, this is just kind of ordinary people going to a conference and doing what we've done today, sit in a hotel, eat lovely salads, and talk to people about clever ideas. But it is the first and possibly the last experience where they will do that, and being LGBT is about the most ordinary thing about them, right? So that's what it feels like to break a norm, okay? So that's what we might have to do, little bits of that. And if we do, and you say that's special treatment, and it's reverse discrimination, and it's excluding the heterosexual people, I shall be cross. Then you haven't gotten anything out of the last 4 hours. Thank you very much.